Hello, so I'm Jeanette, and I'm doing my wiki project on the topic of Missing Tapongdong. As you can see, overall, the beginning section of this page, the main topic is that Missing Tapongdong is about the movement to overthrow the worship of gods, or also described as the movement to overthrow superstition. And so, basically, it sums up the main idea and definition this page is trying to depict in this introduction section right over here. Um, So this page overall goes and contextualizes and goes into more detail by using these sections of time periods, the late Joseon, Japanese occupation, Syngman government, and new community movement. And it goes into legacy, which is just the overall idea of the historical context of how this movement came to be and how it affects current modern day Korea. As you see, the waves are introduced in each of these. So, for this page, there's only two main sources, and it does do a pretty accurate job of making sure each sources are referenced and credited in each place where it should be appropriate and with the appropriate page number. So the two sources they do use are from Connor and Kendall. Both of these sources are the only sources they use throughout the whole definition of Misitapa Undong, and each different sections they use to explain the movement in its historical context. Otherwise, other cross-references are to other Wikipedia pages, which are relevant, and I'll go further detail about whether or not these actually do help the page and its validity. So in order to assess the quality of this page, I'm going to have to break it down to four sections. Are they correctly citing the two sources they do use? Are the two sources even credible? How accurate is their idea of Missing Tapa Undong? And the credibility and relevancy of the link pages that they reference for each section. So going into the first source they use, by Connor, Linda Samuel, and Geoffrey, on healing powders and modernity, traditional medicine, shamanism, science, Asian societies. It is a reliable source since it does exist and it's from a trusted publisher. The publisher is an educational and academic publisher. And the two authors, so Linda H. Connor is from the University of Sydney, anthropology professor, which does help the relevancy considering that the source talks about the history and social context of shamanism in Korea. And the second author, which is Professor Geoffrey Samuel, he's an honorary associate, and as seen here, a 2010 University Buddhist Education Foundation visiting professor. And so he also adds a cultural relevancy focusing directly on Buddhism for Korea. And the second source is from Kendall Laurel, Shamans, Nostalgias, and the IMF, South Korean Popular Religion in Motion, University of Hawaii Press. The University of Hawaii Press is accredited and real existing publisher, and it's even more so relevant because the University of Hawaii Press publishes research in all disciplines of humanities and natural and social sciences in the region Asia and Pacific, which makes it a credible and legitimate source that shows that the publisher shows that the work has went through a publisher of high caliber of academia. And the author themselves, Laura Kendall, she's a curator of Asian ethnographic collections in the Division of Anthropology in American Museum of Natural History, a world-renowned natural history, and also teaches at Columbia University. So she has the authority and the relevant credibility in order to talk about this subject. And so both of these sources checks out to be an academic, relevant, and strong source to use to talk about the topic of Missing Tapa Undang. And this page does a pretty good job on mentioning on specific page numbers throughout whenever they do reference each of the two sources. So I'm going to analyze the validity around the main definitions they do use, because despite them referencing these two sources in each of the other sections, that doesn't directly apply to definition Missing Tapa Undang, but the historical periods that contributed to the movement. Access to the two sources and books for database on PLU is inaccessible, so I do not have the actual quotations or can cross-reference each of the claims and cited sources that they appear to be using. However, I can evaluate the cross-reference pages they do use and see if those are sufficient enough to be used and credited as part of the main definitions for each of these time periods. But so I do use two outside academic sources that do try to cross and check and see if their definition and idea of Missing Tapa Undang is accurate in itself. So I broke it down into two ideas. The first idea is that if there was even a 19th century was there actual Korean shamanism being overthrown. And I used a source by Kim on the concept of Korean religion and religious studies in Korea from the Journal of Korean Religions. And it's an academic Korean religion journals compiled about Korean religion, and it is shown in that book the establishment of religion was prohibited and political actions lost relationship with religion, as quoted by Kim. And so this source does show that there was the occurrence of 19th century overthrow of Korean shamanism. Did not directly reference Missing Tapa Undang, but just the fact that this is mentioned as part of discussion on Korean religious studies shows that it is true. And so also the second main part and definition of the Missing Tapa Undang movement is the series waves of demonization and attempted violent uprooting of Korean shamanism. And so I use a second source to check that on Korean shamanism, the cultural paradox and vitality of indigenous religions by Chung-ho, reviewed by Carell. And so this is a Korean academic source written by a Korean author, and so it was part of a big journal review done by Carell, who's also a professor on the subject. And even though it is a review rather than the original source itself, it's an academic circle being reviewed about the different sources on Korean religion. And it went through a publisher and other peer reviews, so despite being a review, Carell can still be a trusted source on this matter. And so in it, the source says the government handed out punishments to shamans and there used to even be money and vodka paid to people who do hunt down and give heads to the people who practice shamanism in the 1930s of Siberia. So the pages claim that there was a 19th century overthrow of Korean shamanism and it was a violent nature, and this uprooting are both true and supported by these two outside sources, since I don't have access to the two sources they do use. But the two sources they do use are credible. And the last overall idea of evaluating whether or not this whole page is credible and of great quality is looking at each of these sections they reference themselves. So, in the late Joseon period, if we click on that page link, I did some further insight and research into their second source, Kong, Diplomacy and Ideology. And Kong is, sorry, he he is the author, and the source is being published on Asian history. She is said to offer an in-depth overview on intricacies between Korea and Japan. Unfortunately, not much information is found on her besides from her credited people's review on her in-depth explanation. Nothing is really found on the internet for her profession or education to back this up. However, all these other sources right here are seen to be of Japanese origin and from Japanese universities as well as and research and journal studies. And so, despite this being and the author not being able to research and look at the profession or the education, this source did come up on many references of other research journals and studies that do use her source and work as a reference. And so overall, using this cross-link page on Joseon period, it does seem to be a valid and strong resource to add to the context we want to explain around Missing Tapondong. So the second section they do use are the Japanese occupation. And so clicking on the cross-reference page, Korea under Japanese rule, I looked into their Hitoshi Nita Shinto as a non-religion. That's also a really strong credible source since the publisher, the University of Hawaii, as I mentioned earlier, is a publisher on social studies and of Asian and Pacific. And the author themselves has a doctor in Shinto studies at Kogakuin University. And so this author can be seen in another work for this page as well. And thereby being from a publisher on Asian Pacific Studies, Social Studies, and the fact that the author is from Kogakuin University with a doctorate in Shinto Studies makes it a relevant and strong resource to use for this page, and therefore it also adds to the validity and quality information page for the whole Misung Tapongdong page itself. One of the main things that really undermines this page's credibility and reliability is they listed this as one of their main sections of Syngman re-government. However, in this one claim they do use, there's no citation relevant. Protestants in Jeju Island led a campaign against gods, through which they tried to exterminate Jeju's religious tradition in its pantheon of 18,000 deities. That does seems like a direct quote or a paraphrase from one of the sources, which they did not reference or cite. So whether or not this comes from either the two sources they do cite and reference is unsure, and therefore this whole section, which is about a main majority of the small section in general, really undermines and shows that despite only using two of the resources and having it credited whenever it is overall, that some of the points they do make on this page can be dubious and should be cross-referenced and double-checked if someone really wants to use this page as part of their research. On our last section on new community movement, if you click on the page being referenced, I did look at the Boyer William and Byung Mon An source on rural development in South Korea, and it is looking into the publication. It's by the University of Delaware, which one of the authors, William, he's a chair for the Department of Political Science and International Relations at University of Delaware. So it is a legitimate and real publication source of academic caliber and quality. And Byung Man An is the president of Hankuk University, and he is the president of the foreign studies at the Hankuk University. So both of them are strong and well versed in each of their own departments, but it might have some personal interest from Boy William since this is from his own university as a publisher of University of Delaware, being the publisher as well. But both of them are relevant and have the authority to talk about the subject on Korean shamanism and religion. So overall, this source does lack the quality is lower because it only uses two sources for their own to base off of their own definitions, and for pretty much the majority of all the context they use for each of the movement they thought was relevant to behind explaining Missing Tapangdong. The two sources are strong enough to support, and from my other research on other two sources, it is correct that this is a movement in the 19th century that wanted to overthrow Korean shamanism, and it was a violent movement with lots of persecution. But just having two sources is not a good indicator on a page on a pretty intricate topic, even though they use other pages to support as other context details or more information by linking them. It's not sufficient to only use two sources. The other sources do use a plethora of academic sources, but it's not directly related or part of the main sources being used for this page. And with the other main issue on the Syngman re-government, this one area didn't have a citation. So overall, there is copious and proper citation and reference when it is needed, except for one instance. But that brings down the whole credibility and quality of this page if there's only two sources, and for one of the claims, one of the sources isn't referenced. So this whole page on Misi Tampa Undang is sufficient on getting the idea what the definition is. However, for each time period and the historical context surrounding Misi Tampa Undang, it's not a reliable, trustworthy source based on the caliber and amount of sources being used. Alright, and these are the sources, bibliography used for this project. All these are the sources being cross-referenced, and source here for Connor and Kendall are two sources being used for the page itself, and the other sources are the sources I looked at and evaluated. And the two other academic sources I did use to check the validity of the Missing Tampa Undang definition itself. Thank you so much for watching.